Australia needs a gross feed-in tariff to drive the renewable energy revolution that this country can have and that the community desperately wants. Right around the world, we're on the cusp of a whole revolution in the way that energy is provided. This is especially so on the back of the financial collapse, because people are recognising that we need to get activity in the economy, we need to be creating green-collar jobs, and the best way of doing that is to get renewable energy efficiency rolled out right around the world. In Australia, the federal government has been dragging its feet on actually getting a nationally consistent gross feed-in tariff. People are crying out for it. Farmers want it as an adaptation strategy to the drought. Communities are saying they desperately want to be enabled to produce their own electricity and put it into the market for other people. This is the way to go, and yet because the federal government has been dragging its feet, each state government has adopted a different strategy. Almost all the state feed-in tariff legislation is flawed. It's either a net tariff in some places, or it's only restricted to small scale, or only restricted to photovoltaics, for example. What the Greens want is a gross national feed-in tariff that applies to all forms of renewable energy at all scales, so from residential right through to utility scale. It's a fantastic way to respond to climate change, to reduce our emissions. It's a fantastic way to create new jobs in the new green economy, and it's a great way to respond to the financial crisis. So all we're waiting for is the federal government to act. In New South Wales, as recently as yesterday, the minister's saying if the federal government doesn't act, then the state government will. The problem with sending it off to COAG is that it's a mechanism for delay. The states will argue amongst each other and will end up with the lowest common denominator. Just as the federal government has gone ahead with its carbon pollution reduction scheme as a national scheme, and it's got a mandatory renewable energy target, we're saying legislate now for a national gross feed-in tariff. Well, it's very clear that the Rudd government wants to favour coal. Whilst it's talking about renewable energy, it is actively resisting going a national route with a strategy which we know deploys renewable energy. The British government, for example, has recently said it's going to adopt a feed-in tariff because it's recognised that that is what has driven the energy revolution in Germany and in Spain. I've recently come back from the World Conservation Congress in Spain, and right through the south of Spain you now see huge wind farms and solar arrays as a result of a feed-in tariff in that country. So I think the federal government on the one hand says a lot about renewables, but if you look where they're directing their attention and their money, it is all to keeping Australia stuck with coal. I have with me today all the other representatives from each of the states. It might be useful just to hear from Queensland in particular about the costs, because one of the reasons the federal government says, oh, you can't do this, is because you will have a small additional charge to energy bills right across the system. In Germany it's about a cup of cappuccino a year per household. I'd just be interested for you to hear from Ronan from Queensland.
I understand that the state government has modelling that indicates that the difference between a poor feed-in tariff, which is what they've adopted, and a world-leading feed-in tariff, which is what they could adopt, is equivalent to about a cost of $1 per household per year, $1 per year, to give renewable energy a real start in Queensland and in Australia. It's cheap at double the price, $1 a year. I mean, how could you say no to that? The failed privatisation of the retail arm of the electricity industry in Queensland, supported by both Labor and the Liberal National Party, has cost consumers per household around $120 per year in increased charges and fees. I mean, that was so that the government could privatise an asset that we already owned, and they thought that that was a smart idea, and the Liberal National Party thought that that was a smart idea, but $1 a year was too much for Labor and the Liberal Nationals to give us a world-leading renewable energy sector.
Thank you. The Greens have the gross renewable energy target legislation in the Senate. There is to be a committee report handed down this week on that legislation. Out of the 123 submissions, 121 were in favour of the gross feed-in tariff, the national gross feed-in tariff, and the matter is to go to COAG at the end of the month. So this is very timely, and here at the Australian Greens conference this weekend there was unanimous support from the Australian Greens for the federal government to introduce a national gross feed-in tariff. It's been on the COAG agenda for some months. It was shelved at the last time. I suspect this time it's back on the agenda, but it'll probably get shelved again because of the financial crisis globally, because this government doesn't seem to recognise that a solution to climate change is also a solution to the whole of the financial crisis. We're actually in a win-win scenario, which is why Obama is just going to put $150 billion in the US over 5 years into renewables and efficiency, because he can see that's the way to stimulate the economy. So I think that there's a high probability COAG will shelve it until next year, and it can just roll on and on. Our whole experience of COAG has been that once the states start fighting amongst themselves, and they will, because South Australia is wedded to a net tariff, and other places want a gross tariff. Some people want just photovoltaics, some people want just residential and not the utility scale, and you can imagine this will be a barney that goes on for at least a year, if not longer, and at the end of it we'll end up with the lowest common denominator national approach, instead of going for the feds saying let's get into it now and do something good for the whole country.
What would
the lowest common denominator would be for them to adopt a net system across the country, to be only for very small scale and restricted only to photovoltaics. That would be a bad outcome for Australia and for the renewable energy sector, because with the MRET, the mandatory renewable energy target, wind is is the industry sector most benefiting from that. We need the feed-in tariff to bring on solar thermal and bring on photovoltaics, bring on geothermal, and that isn't going to happen if you restrict the tariff in such a way that it has a mechanism it won't drive the deployment. So it'll only be sort of small scale and ad hoc, and we need it to be systemic, national, big, unlimited. Governments all around the country should be setting energy efficiency targets. We should have a national energy efficiency target, and one of the ways of achieving efficiency is to change not only the design of houses but the lighting in houses, going to full insulation as well. In terms of lighting, changing the globes mean that there will be environmental consequences, just as there are for all technologies. We need a scheme in Australia for looking at the whole of the waste stream, and the same applies to all the new technologies. Just because you've got waste issues with new technologies doesn't mean to say you shouldn't adopt them. What it does mean is at the time you adopt them, you develop a closed loop system so that you're not adding to the burden of landfill.